Good morning, everyone.
You're painting me pictures of Mrs. and Mr.
Welcome to the Oregon Realtors Forms panel, where we will be introducing our new forms to you all. I am Ashley Fordham. I'm your president-elect. I'm really excited to be in front of you today, and I'm very excited to introduce this lovely panel of guests. But before we do that, we have some housekeeping items that I'd like to just remind you all of. In-person attendees should be checked in with staff members at the door to receive your continuing education credit for this session. Virtual attendees, your CE is already being tracked. If they're logged into your account with the correct name, you will be tracked. If your name isn't correct, please be sure to rename yourself or message the Zoom meeting host to get it updated. Virtual participants can follow along. All questions and comments must be asked through the microphone. No matter how loud you are, if you are not using the mic when speaking, we will ask you to repeat your question at the microphone. In-person and virtual attendees, to ask a question, please raise your hand and wait to be called on at the next question. With that, I am extremely honored and privileged to introduce our panelist, our immediate past president, Jeff Wyron. That's the first time I've been able to say that.
Another month. I got one more month.
Jeremy Rogers, Director of Legal Affairs and Public Policy, and Nicholas Peasley, Staff Attorney. So with that, I think we should just dive right in. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves at all or talk a little bit about?
I think I know everybody. I'm good.
That's what the script said, but I'm like, everyone in this room knows everyone, so I feel
Right.
like it's probably not necessary. Okay, so to get our session started, I thought it would be appropriate to ask just a few general questions. So, Jeff, let's start with you really quickly.
Sure.
Why did Oregon Realtors decide to create its own forms program?
So 2 years ago, roughly, it was the goal of the executive committee at that time and presented to the board for Oregon Realtors to develop or administer a statewide form as a member benefit, not-for-profit. For a couple of reasons. First of all, we want to be able to provide it as a member benefit rather than having you to pay for forms outside of it as a member benefit. And secondly, I think administration and having a higher level of influence and control over the documents was a bigger part of the goal. And I think you can see that if you look north right now at what's happening in Washington. There's a huge forms change that just was rolled out, as a matter of fact, on Monday of this week. That will change the standard of practice. And if you're a licensee in Washington, it's going to change how you negotiate, and not only the buyer service agreement and their listing contract, but in the body of the sale agreement itself. And the statewide form there is administered by a private MLS system, and I'm sure that the Washington Association of Realtors had some input. I'm assuming they did. I'm not speaking to their process because I don't know it. But it speaks to why we wanted to have a statewide form administered by the statewide association. It's a document that affects every realtor in the state who uses it, and we feel like it should be administered by the state association. So that was the motivation for that. So 2 years ago, we made an offer to purchase OREF and bring the OREF forms library and the intellectual property of that in-house. That offer was rejected, and so the state, which was one of the owners of OREF with a 20% interest, withdrew at that time, and there was a 2-year non-compete that concluded on October 1st. And so now we're ready to administer our own forms. We did make another attempt to purchase the OREF library earlier this year. That offer was also rejected. So there are going to be 2 forms libraries in the state that you'll have the option to work with and choose from. And I think that that'll be just fine. You got great options. Both of them are great products.
Thank you. So, Jeremy, I think the question on everybody's mind really is, what is the rollout of these forms going to look like from a platform's perspective, and how will our realtors be able to integrate that into their daily business when using the forms?
Great. Well, thanks, Ashley. First off, if you want to take a preview of the forms and get a little more information, we have a forms room that's open throughout the rest of the convention upstairs. We're also going to be doing a deep dive into the details of the forms in a session, a breakout session this afternoon, so please join for that. There's a website up right now, www.orforms.org. Sometime next week, we'll send an email out to all of the members of Oregon Realtors with a link to a preview of all the forms, so you can see the entire forms library. We'll take some additional feedback on those documents over the course of the next month, and we'll finalize those documents, and our intent is to have them available for use beginning January 1st. We've been working with all of the major transaction management and forms technology platforms to get licensing agreements in place to make the forms available on those platforms. And so the firms that we've been working with include Brokerment, DocuSign, Dotloop, Form Simplicity, SkySlope, and ZipForms. Of course, if your brokerage uses a proprietary platform or any platform other than those, we'd love to engage in a licensing agreement with those entities as well, so please let us know. In addition to that, for members who do not already have paid access to a platform, we will have both Zip forms and SkySlope forms available as a member benefit to Oregon Realtors members. So if you want to use the Oregon Realtors forms and you don't already have a brokerage account for SkySlope, for example, you'd be able to get the SkySlope forms program at no additional cost to you, as be included in your membership dues, and access the forms there. Same thing with Zip forms. And that will, again, our goal is to have that all ready for you at the first of the year, so that you can start using the documents in your transactions at that time. If you're already on one of those platforms, the way it will work is the Oregon Forms library will just be there as an option for you, so you'll be able to select it from a drop-down in your SkySlope account or your Zip Forms account, or whatever you use, that you want to access the Oregon Forms library. If you're a member in good standing, those firms are just going to be checking the NRDS database to confirm that you're a member, and if you are, then you'll have access to those forms. If you want to take advantage of those member benefit options, you'd come to our forms website and sign up through there, and it would kick you over to SkySlope or to Zip Forms to get your account, and you'd have the forms available for you in that fashion.
Can I pick up a little bit on that and clarify? So for example, our brokerage is licensed in Arizona. Arizona has a statewide form product. If you're an Arizona licensee, you log into SkySlope. If you're a brand new licensee or a new user of their product, you log into your SkySlope account, you type in your NERDS number, boom, you have the forms. So that is structurally how it will work here too. As a realtor in the state of Oregon, you're going to have access to this library of forms and the platforms. I can't speak to what the denominator will be in Zip Forms and all of the other platforms. I'm assuming it will also be the NERDS number, because that's how they'll verify that you're a member in good standing. But it will be that simple. You just plug in your NERDS number, and whatever platform you're on, you'll have access to your realtor forms.
Awesome. Nicholas, I know that when I've been circulating and speaking with people the last week, a lot of the questions that I've been receiving have been around the training and what the structure of that will look like. Can you speak to that?
Yes, so it's working?
Yes.
Oh, give it a little closer. We have a plan to do a sort of a multi-pronged training process. So in the first place, on the website, there will be available a training video library. The plan is to have those trainings attached to every single independent provision of these forms. So you would pull up, for example, the purchase and sale agreement, the residential purchase and sale agreement, and there would be somewhere in the ballpark of 60 separate videos that are about 30 seconds long each, which each one relates to a specific provision of the agreement. So if you have a question about a specific provision of the agreement, you can jump to that training and get the minute training on exactly that provision. In addition to that, we also have brokerage trainings where you can sign up and have Jeremy, myself, or potentially a different staff member or one of the major investors that we're trained on this? Is that role? Task force members, that's what I was looking for, will come and give a training about the actual forms themselves. So a deep dive or a specific training for your brokerage with how to use these forms. In addition to all of that, we also are going to have text files available on the website at some point once we've got the videos uploaded to the website. We'll begin working on actual text documents so that you'll have a multimedia approach to actually getting trained on the documents. You can have in-person, you can watch videos that explain the trainings themselves, or once we have it done, there'll be a text file that explains the provisions and the forms themselves. So a buffet of options exists.
And I'll just add in too, in the run-up period here, which we're sort of calling our soft launch until they're actually available for use in your transaction platforms at the beginning of the year, we'll be hosting, and in fact, we'll probably continue this through next year. We're hosting an open house every Friday where you can just zoom in. Nicholas and I will be available to answer any questions you have. So, for example, after you get that link to preview the forms next week, pop into the open house next Friday or the Friday after, ask any questions that you have, give us any feedback that you have. And you can sign up currently for that open house for any of them on the website, www.orforms.org. And you also can sign up for the brokerage briefings that Nicholas mentioned on the website.
You just scared all of the major investors in the room, Nicholas. A bunch of them going, wait a minute, I didn't sign up to do training with my $1,000 contribution. By the way, we need 8 more major investors to hit our goal. Just putting a plug out there.
I apologize if I gave you a fright.
We promise not to make you train on the new forms.
And actually, if I could add one more thing on the training issue too, is that many of you for a long time have used the Oregon buyer and seller advisories. And we've updated those documents to now just kind of follow along and key more closely to our transaction documents. And so those will also be really helpful tools for you and for your clients once these forms launch. And we really actually encourage you and really we're going to ask you to use those. If you're going to use the Oregon Realtors forms, use the Oregon Realtors buyer and seller advisories along with them, because that advisory language in those forms is really helpful to people understanding the overall transaction and also getting some context for the documents. And then it'll be a much smoother sailing using the documents if you're also associating it with the buyer and seller advisories.
Yeah, and actually, a little more explicitly stated than that, you want to use the advisory before you use the form. The form does say to the buyer and seller, you acknowledge that you've reviewed the advisory, right? So the form is a little shorter than the form that you've been used to, and some of that is because the advisory language is in the advisory and not in the agreement between the parties. So you want to make sure that you are presenting the Oregon Property Buyer Advisory to your buyers and the Oregon Property Seller Advisory to your sellers in concert with the sale agreement so that they have that information.
That's awesome. It's sort of sounds like you're building a cake and adding layers on as needed, which is comprehensive, but also fantastic.
Yeah, and you might get to this, but we haven't really publicized too much that a high percentage of the phone calls to the legal hotline at Oregon Realtors are relative to your transactions and to the forms used in those transactions. Since you're being given a member benefit in forms, you're also going to be given the legal hotline now. You don't have to pay for a subscription to the legal hotline starting in 2023. It's just going to be available to you. Yeah. Because, hey, look, that's one of the benefits of having a form administered by your state association. It all loops into risk management. A lot of the legal hotline calls are relative to your transactions, relative to the forms that you use. We're administering those forms now, so if you have questions about them, you should be able to call and get some answers and not have to pay extra for that. So that's a big part of this.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay, so generally speaking, what are some of the key features of the forms and the forms library that we can look forward to once they're available for use in January?
So one of the key features at the start point of the forms is in the purchase and sale agreement, the information that the parties need to actually mold in the contract, so the purchase price, closing, the specific material terms of the contract, they're coalesced on the first page of the agreement, much in the same way as it would be on a summary page or in a letter of intent. So there is most of the information the parties want to know on the first page, and then on the second, third, and fourth page, you have all the time-related provisions. So if you're using the form, the first page is all of your material elements, the second, third, fourth page are all of your time-related elements, and then the rest of the pages are the boilerplate, which is, and the provisions that shouldn't be modified, how you terminate a contract, how you move the earnest money, things like that. What this essentially does for you is it restricts the amount of swiping through the document you have to do to find the material provisions. In addition to that, it also helps the parties sort of locate the information they need quickly within the contract itself. You'll know whether or not you want to sign the document by the time you're done with the third or fourth page, if even by then. Usually by the end of the first page, the seller will know what the purchase price is, when it's closing, and if things have been waived, and they'll understand whether or not they want to continue on that contract.
Yeah, additionally, you'll see some, okay, not to steal your thunder.
Oh, no. Oh, well, I was going to say, another key change or key kind of feature that you'll notice it might be a little bit different than what you're used to is the terminations. So the way we've set up terminations and default is that, and this is pretty standard in a lot of other types of contracts, if both parties are promising things throughout this agreement. And the question often arises, well, what do you do if someone doesn't do something that they promised? And say you're on the other side of that, and you think that the other side didn't do something they promised, you're not sure how to get them to do it, you're not sure if your client can back out and get their earnest money back, for example, because, hey, did that other party breach the agreement already, and does that allow me now to get out? So we've sort of just formalized all of that around how contract law works, and that is we've created a notice of default and opportunity to cure, and we've listed all of the potential defaults in the sale agreement on the buyer side and the seller side. So if you feel like the one side of the transaction hasn't done something that they promised to do, you'll have a form that will list that thing, and you will be able to check a box, send it to the other side and say, hey, you had promised to do this, you didn't do it, you have 3 days to do it. And if you don't do it, then this is definitively a default. My client can back out of the contract and retain the earnest money if they're the buyer, or keep the earnest money if they're the seller. And so, and then we have a termination document that just follows on with that. So if the default wasn't cured, you send the termination document, it's done. Both sides don't need to sign the termination document. If you've gone through this process and one side terminates, the contract's terminated, then the question is, was it, if you're on the seller side, if you didn't do it, if you terminated for an unlawful reason, you still could be at risk of specific performance. Or if you're on the buyer side and you terminated for an unlawful reason, you could still be at risk of losing your earnest money. But if you're following along and using these documents and checking the boxes that are in there, then it's going to be a pretty seamless, clear process. And if you get to that dispute resolution phase over the earnest money, you can have all the evidence you need. We sent a notice on this date that showed exactly what the other side wasn't doing they had promised to do. We gave them time to fix that thing. They didn't fix it. And so then we terminated, and therefore we had a right to do so, and that's why we should be able to keep the earnest money. And it'll really smooth out those dispute resolution processes.
Sure.
Sure.
First off, thank you guys, Margaret Page, Tillamook County Board. Maybe somebody really does listen to prayers. Quick question. I love this termination process that somebody's rethunk. Is escrow still going to be required, still going to require us to get the buyer and seller signature to deal with the earnest money?
So under Oregon law, escrow isn't allowed to to give the money out, to distribute money, unless they have identical instructions from both parties, with exceptions. The seller property disclosure statement is a unilateral disbursement, and if the parties have an agreement, so you say this is non-refundable, then it's unilateral. But otherwise, under Oregon law, we do still need a signature that's identical from both parties. So our termination document and the response document will have a chunk in there for that instruction to escrow. And if they're identical, they say this money goes to buyer, this money goes to buyer on both the forms, that's sufficient for escrow to then pass the money out. So the forms have a space for it. We can't guarantee your parties will agree with each other and put identical instructions down. If that's the case, then you have the same problem you have currently if the parties don't agree.
But they won't be asked on the same document to sign that, right? So let me illustrate this a little bit for you, because this is a really big change in practice, but I think it's a very positive change. We had a licensee in our brokerage in Arizona where they do have this document. They do have a notice of default and remedy to cure, I think is what it's called there. So for example, what do you do if the seller didn't complete the repairs that they agreed to, right? There's a little bit of a gray area in regard to how that's handled. And who gets the earnest money? What rights does the buyer really have to enforce? Seller, you said you'd do these things. I want to close because otherwise I'm going to lose my lock, but I don't want to give up my right to make you do what you agreed to do, right? So the notice of default and opportunity to cure helps to answer that. And so we had that example with an agent in Arizona where the seller did not complete the repairs and pretty much was saying to the buyer, don't care, you got to close. And the buyer was able to submit that document and protect their right, even after closing, of saying, well, I notified you of the default. I had to close because I was forced to close to keep my lock. But prior to closing, I notified you of the default, and that puts them in a much better position of trying to get performance on those repairs, even if they had to close. So it's a better process in that way, and it helps to take away some of that gray area that exists. The other thing that you'll see, for example, on the repair addendum, is the repair addendum will have the agreement of what's going to happen on repairs. And then on that same document will be the notification from the seller that the repairs were completed, right? You're going to see, here's what was agreed to. Seller completes the repairs. They're going to send that document with their signature saying, we're notifying you that we've done what was agreed to on this document. Then the buyer has an opportunity to say, oh, okay, I accept what you've done here, or I don't accept, and I'm going to submit the notice of default and opportunity to cure because I want you to actually do it right, right? So it'll be one document instead of multiple documents, and the process will be very objective and very clean, just boom, 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 here's what you do.
I guess the last piece for that, with regards to the form library itself, in the deep dive we'll show this, but the forms library is broken up thematically into pieces. So there's a numbering system, form 1.1, 1.2, and so on, 2.1, 2.3. And each one of the first numeral represents a type of form. So purchase and sales agreements are your 1-point-somethings. All of your addendums are your 2-point-somethings. If it's a disclosure, 3-point-something. And so the forms have been broken down in what at the start will be a completely arbitrary numbering system, but once it becomes understood, they are located based on a clear numbering structure and a thematic structuring. So it will prevent the number of times where you need to look at something for like Form 81 and then what is 81 necessarily. You can just go down the line with a theme. If you're looking for something about tenants, it's in the 7-point section. If you're looking for something that relates to a broker agreement, 9-point something agreements. And so there will be a thematic breakdown.
So I think what you're hearing is that the task force worked really, really hard to identify what we felt was gray areas in the marketplace and said, okay, how can we wrap up this negotiation in good faith and make sure that all the parties are coming to an agreement and making sure that we are moving the ball forward as best we can in that good faith effort. So it's super exciting. With that being said, I know that the conversation around 2 sets of forms has been a concern for all of you. So I would just like to ask the panel a little bit more about that and kind of what your thoughts are moving forward.
Great, and thanks for the question. And I think, as Jeff said earlier, now there's now going to be 2 great options out there for statewide real estate transaction forms. And we do recommend that you keep a transaction on one set of forms because you don't want to be mixing and matching, provisions that may be inconsistent. We've actually created a form in our library that can help you do that, whichever form that you prefer the transaction to be on. We have a generic form that allows that to happen. And of course, a buyer's going to submit an offer on whichever form the buyer submits it on. At the end of the day, the seller is the one that has the power of acceptance. And so the seller sort of is in more of a power position about deciding, what form ultimately, they want the transaction to take place on. So our document, what it does is it gives the seller the opportunity to send a notice to the buyer that says, hey, thanks for the offer, like the terms that you put in there, like the price that you put in there, but our firm is using this particular form, and can you resubmit the offer on that form? So we've created that as one way to help facilitate that dialogue to get to the place of making sure that the transaction's on one form. But I think the broader issue is you've got two sets of forms, drafted by attorneys with input from Realtor members from around the state, and you've got great options, and if you're using either set of those forms, you're going to be in good shape because those forms are designed to manage your risk.
Yeah, I would say too that while there is going to be certain provisions and certain forms, for example, the repair addendum, that will be different, and you're not going to want to submit a repair addendum on one form and counter it on another form, because those will be different terms. But a counteroffer is a pretty objective document, right? And an addendum is a pretty objective document, right? There's a place to identify who's involved, there's a big blank spot in the middle, and there's a place at the bottom for people to sign. So if an offer comes in on one form and your client accepts that, and you want to submit an addendum from the other library, I don't know that that's a huge issue or a conflict. Right? I'll let the attorneys answer that, I guess, but I don't see that as a bigger problem than the specific provisions themselves of the sale agreement. So making sure that you understand the sale agreement and that your client understands the provisions of that sale agreement before they sign it is going to be the bigger issue.
Yeah, and a generic addendum, for example, is going to be very similar on both documents, right? But I think what you want to avoid is any addendum that's referring back to some other provision of the base sale agreement. If you use a different base sale agreement, then the assumption about that provision might be different, right? And so that's where you really when you're talking about documents that are have specific information already written into them, you really want to stick with one set of forms just to avoid the possibility of conflicting provisions. And there may or may not be, but to avoid that chance, you want to stick with one set.
Carrie?
Carrie Hartnett with PMAR and Clatsop Association. I have a scenario that happened just recently that you kind of made me think of. Someone submitted an offer on a duplex that was on a condo form. We didn't counter because the market shift is the only offer we have, and we didn't want to have the buyer resubmit, right? So we just created an addendum. Now you're having us possibly go back to the buyer and say, you need to resubmit this. That's scary.
Well, and I guess you can also just respond on the same form. So I guess the instruction I was giving is if for some reason your brokerage does have a preference about which form that you're using.
Right.
But there's two forms out there.
Right.
There's training available on both. And so I think a lot of brokers and brokerages are going to be in a position that whichever form the offer comes in on, they'll be in a position to respond on the same set of forms.
Well, in this case, we just could use an addendum to say we're not providing HOA documents for a duplex. But to have them have to rewrite the whole offer, I don't know, in the shifting market, that's just really scary to me.
It is the seller's choice to send in the request form. So it is worth noting that in this case, if the seller is worried about the market shifting and they don't want the buyer to resubmit an offer, the seller does not have to request a change. But if the seller is particular in this instance, so for example, the seller's broker tells them, I only really operate with ORIF forms. I only operate with Oregon Realtors forms, and the seller is okay with the risk that comes with telling them resubmit the offer, then that's the seller's option. But in this case, for example, if your seller goes, I don't know if I can deal with another 2 days of waiting, in that case, it's the seller's choice to make the request.
Okay.
So the seller just needs to accept the risk of potentially using a form that the realtor is
it's
not
really
as
up to
comfortable
us.
with.
because the sellers are taking our advice essentially on what, like here, I mean, essentially, it's like, okay, you're gonna write an offer or you're gonna wait for an offer and we're using these forms.
Yeah, well, and again, let me just be really
Education.
clear, and I probably
Sorry.
started with the wrong, because I was responding to the narrow rather than the broad. The broad issue is, you've got two sets of forms, you have access to training on both. Your brokerage can and be in a position to respond on any type of form that the offer comes in on. So you don't have to shift it. It's
Right.
just a matter if for some reason, as Nicholas said, your brokerage is very particular and says, we only are using this form. We have a way to help facilitate getting it onto one form. But there's absolutely no reason why you can't just use the form that the offer came in on. Yeah.
One thing to mention as well is on the legal hotline, this is something that actually comes up periodically with commercial businesses where someone has an offer submitted on a CAB form and they go, I don't know how CAB forms work. I don't use them regularly. Can I request that they put it on the ORF commercial form? And the answer that we typically give is you can request that it be resubmitted. That's acceptable. The parties should just use the same form across the board because something might be lost in the shuffle. And so this is the current practice that we offer on the legal hotline. Essentially, use one type of form throughout the transaction if you're using a form, but you don't have to change away from. So if you don't use CAB forms typically, you can use the CAB form. You just need to understand that there may be a sharp learning curve as you're using it. And so it's more a risk management tool where you can make the request than an actual like dictate from above that requires the usage.
Right.
Next question.
Good morning, Mike Kurlinger with RVAR. It sounds like largely these new forms are just going to clarify some language and maybe put some terms together, but I'm curious if there's any terms that have actual material changes that could significantly impact the transaction, and if we're taking on any kind of liability by recommending one form over the other, indicating that we have a preference. Well, this form says this says that, and that was detrimental to me during this transaction.
Yeah, so again, I think because both of these sets of forms are statewide forms drafted by attorneys, input from Realtor members from around the state, you're solid using either form. And there's I know we've heard reference to some case out there from the 60s that described it was escrow agents in that instance, like choosing between forms being the practice of law or something like that. And in that instance, those were first they were deeds. And second, since that time, our practice of law statutes have been updated significantly, and there's actually a very specific provision that says, if you're a real estate professional acting in your capacity, under Chapter 696, in arranging a real estate transaction, you're not engaged in the practice of law. But in terms of, so I think the liability issue for you is using a form that you haven't taken the time to be trained upon, right? We're going to give you access to all the training that you need, but if you haven't used our training, don't use our forms. Okay? So I think that's the big thing is that you have to take it upon yourself to do the training if you're going to use a particular form.
Margaret.
Oh, Mouthy Margaret here again. So if I counsel a seller client that we want to encourage all offers and paperwork that comes in to be on one form library or the other, and seller, I prefer this form library, and would like to ask you to allow me to state that on the multiple listing service private remarks. Seller asks for all offers to be submitted on this forms library. Are we going to run into restraint of trade issues?
I mean, again, I think as a default, you all will be in a position to be trained on and to use both forms if you choose to do so, right? And I think that's a perfectly acceptable way to go forward. If someone were to say, no, we really like one form or the other, and your seller agrees, and it's ultimately your seller's decision, and you put in the MLS remarks to use one or the other, and it's just your firm and you're not collaborating with other firms, I don't think that would be a restraint of trade. I think if there was collaboration between competing firms on that type of a thing, that would be a significant problem. Yeah.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Patrick.
Patrick. Is it
Give
on?
it a minute.
Okay, there we go. Patrick Eiler, Rogue Valley Association of Realtors. So I'm kind of thinking the way Carrie was thinking is, how is this going to work? I think maybe you kind of answered the question, Jeremy, but just for clarification. So let's say that I write on Oregon Realtors forums, and the office that I'm writing to, they have a policy that they write on the ORF forms, okay? So I submit the offer, and then that agent advises their client to use their policy form, and then we have to come back and they ask us to rewrite on that office's policy form. You're right in that the seller and the buyer are the ones that decide what forms are going to be used, but I can see a scenario where that office policy is recommended to that client to use. Isn't that kind of skating that line a little bit about practicing law, even though both forms are used and approved by attorneys? You know what I'm saying? I'm just concerned that we're going to get into the same thing. Well, we're going to choose this escrow officer. No, we want you to use this escrow officer. And we get into that thing where I think that if I write a form on either platform, then that's a legal document. And if we start getting in the middle of the buyer and the seller on forms, I can see a potential for problems down the road.
Yeah, and so first, again, what I would say is that the most important thing is the training, right? The biggest risk to you is using forms that you don't understand and that you haven't been trained on, right? And so I think if you're trained, and what I would recommend is be trained on both forms, right? And be prepared to, engage on any form that comes in. And I would say the same thing. If you're in a market where there's a lot of new construction, and there's a particular builder that has a form that they use, get familiar with that builder form too, because at the end of the day, you might have to use it, right? So I think the most important thing is getting trained on the forms. We're not encouraging anybody to say that you should only submit on this form, or you should only, we're just saying if that were the case, if a firm were to say, well, we haven't had time to train yet on this one form, and so we're requesting for the time that they come in on this form until we get trained on it, the way that you would be able to facilitate that. Now, the document that we have says that, hey, if you are requesting that offer come in on one form, then you have to provide it. If that other person doesn't have that form, and you're the one selecting that, then you have to provide it. So yeah, we're not encouraging people to get in the business of saying that we use one form or the other, but I would say the big distinction that you need to worry about is less about the practice of law and much more about, are you trained on a form, and if you were using a form with your clients that you didn't understand and weren't trained on, that would be something I'd be much more concerned about than the practice of law issue.
Yeah.
Because these are forms that drafted by attorneys, input from realtors, standard of practice across the whole country of statewide forms compiled in that way, and that is part of your real estate professional practice to use those forms, either one.
Yeah, I think the problem's going to solve itself here shortly down the road anyway, but just thank you. Thank you.
I think it's also, I'd like to pick up on that a little bit, worth noting that even within the current forms library that you're used to, the sale agreement has an inspection contingency, and there's a separate addendum for the inspection contingency. Are you practicing law by recommending one or the other of those preferences to your client? That, no, I think you should use the professional inspection addendum instead of the professional inspection contingency that's embodied in the sale agreement itself. That same logic, that Patrick, that you just illustrated, carries through to that, right? Which one's better? And if you're advising one way or the other, are you in fact practicing law even within the body of the one document that you've had for however many years? And an additional point beyond that, it used to be Stephen's Nest, I can't remember what it's called now. Yeah. Has been a form available in this state for, I don't know, ever, right? Nobody recommends it. Is it the practice of law to use the form that you've been using over that form, and why wouldn't we then recommend that form to our clients and say you have this option? But nobody ever has, and nobody does. So
John, and then Erica, I think you have a virtual question.
Thank you. Good morning, John Hoops from Eugene. And I've worked with Jeff on the Aura Forms Committee over the years, and he's a very clear thinker. Here, I understand the thought that here are the names, here are the dates, here's the rest of the stuff. I've always liked the form where the escrow instructions are on page 6 and something else was on page 9. It made me hope that my agents and their clients would actually read all 11 pages or parts of them. My concern with, and especially since the days of DocuSign, and I've had the wonderful opportunity to manage hundreds of agents and thousands of transactions. What I hear so often is, well, what about this? Well, let's look on page whatever. It says this. Oh, God, I forgot that was in there. Or, more often, I didn't know it was in there. And I know the education piece is going to be ginormous. However, my concern is I can hear agents saying, well, yeah, the names are on the first page, then we've got some dates, but the rest is just boilerplate. What that means is no one is going to read that. And I know in my heart, and it makes me crazy, that when we DocuSign stuff to clients, do they read all 10 or 11 pages? No one is saying, oh, yes, they do. I had an agent who used to read all 11 pages to their buyers before she let them sign it. She's now buried under the building because no one could deal with that. But it's just the practical concern of Realtor training, and the training is going to be out there. Jeremy, you pointed that out very clearly. And then kind of question 1A, when you start talking about and I forget the form, but we're getting near a deadline, and if you don't perform, then this happens. That sounds getting really close to a lawyer talking. Usually when it gets to, we're getting gnarly, and I think everybody's upset, and I'm not sure about the earnest money, I say to people, you should probably call an attorney and involve them, because we're getting into now contract law as opposed to real estate. I'm concerned about that line, so appreciate your help.
If I can take that. So, John, you're right. And training, which we've been saying is the big factor. No agent should be just sending a document out to their client to sign without reviewing fully the document with their client. By the way, that's part of your code of ethics. Okay? So, to say, we all know this happens all the time, and I think that that's reasonably true, but that's a disappointment of our industry, and we need to do better. So whether the material components of an offer are mixed along the pages 1 through 11 or embodied primarily on the first 3.5 pages of the document doesn't change the reality that you are a professional and your job is to advise your client and make sure that they understand what they're signing before they sign it. That's just a fact. So the training is the biggest component to that. Regarding the notice of default and opportunity to cure and the concern about that flirting with contract law, it is a contract, right? And so contract law is part of that contract. So making the contract more accurate to contract law, right, and dovetail into what, if there is a dispute, an attorney is going to say, well, did you have this, and did you do this, and did the transaction flow in this way, I think helps the clients. And the other thing that I would say is lots of states have that as part of their real estate library. Lots of states have a notice of default and remedy to cure as part of their real estate library for the agents to be able to advise their clients on.
Yeah, I'm just reiterating that. I mean, we're systematizing something that already exists. I mean, we get those calls on the legal hotline all the time right now. The other side didn't do this. Is that material enough that that's a breach of the contract? How should I, if you say, oh, well, you got to go talk to an attorney. Well, we've just laid it out. I mean, there's no need to talk to an attorney when the parties have a contract that says, if you don't do something in here, you'll get this notice. It'll give you 3 days to do it. And if you still haven't done it, then you've definitively breached the contract. So we're just taking care of that all up front so you don't have to use an attorney and there's no independent thinking practice of law going on because it's already in the form. And then I'll hand it over to Nicholas to respond as well, but just on the On the issue of, again, I think the training's the most important thing, and I think, this argument that two well-drafted forms that have been drafted by attorneys from realtor associations involved, with, member involvement and expert involvement, that they can't simultaneously coexist because, people can't hold two concepts in their mind at one time, or they can't get trained on two things is, the logical conclusion of that argument is that you can only ever have one provider anywhere, and that I don't think that that's how any market for anything works. And I think if you take that argument to the logical conclusion, it becomes absurd and kind of flies in the face of everything we know about markets and consumers and, competition and everything else, so.
A last sort of point on the practice of law thing. So generally when the forms are drafted by attorneys and provided to the realtors, it's the same thing as if you had an attorney draft your own specialty form. So if you do some unique situation where you're selling a specialized kind of houseboat or something like that, you'll have a form that gets drafted by an attorney, and that's a valid form to use because the realtor is not practicing law in that case. The attorney is practicing law and providing their recommendation to the realtor that says, this is valid, this is a fine contract, it works in the following ways, advise your client on it, and if the client doesn't understand, the client should talk to an attorney. These forms are the same way. The attorneys have drafted them, they've provided them to you with explanations and with advisories, and if the client doesn't understand material and it's not in the training or it hasn't been provided, then they should seek out an attorney for that fringe scenario where it's not understood. But in all cases where it's just part of the contract itself, if it's written into the contract and it's valid and it's vetted by an attorney and it's vetted by the industry, that's not the practice of law in the way that we do real estate law in Oregon. Essentially, the attorney vetting and the industry vetting takes it out of the realm of practice of law.
Thank you. Erica?
All right. I have a question from Danielle Powell. Will the MLS Connect feature be available for the new forms for auto-population of the property feature and agent information?
Yeah, so that was one of the things that we ensured was in our licensing agreements with all of the vendors. So unless there is, frankly, yeah, for the vendors to license our forms, that has to be in place. And, so unless it's a problem on the MLS side, not related to our forms or our vendors, then that would be the only reason that wouldn't be occurring. Yeah.
I have another question from Louis Hoffman at CORE. So if you are subscribed to the new OR forms and have to deal with the ORF forms, that you receive it, would it still be necessary to be necessary to still purchase ORF forms, not to commingle? I'm sorry, let me reread that because word salad. All right. If you are subscribed to the new OR forms and have to deal with the ORF forms that you receive, then it would still be necessary to purchase the ORF forms, not to commingle, correct?
So the answer to that is sort of the same answer we give for non-represented parties and for situations where a party is using a specialty form like a CAB form if you don't have access to it. The other party that is presenting the form that you do not have. So if you don't have access to ORF and someone presents an offer to you on an ORF form, you can say, I need forms to complete this transaction. You need to provide me with all the forms that I need for this. And it's the obligation, it is the obligation of the party that is using that form and requesting that form be used to provide those forms to the other party. So if you have a non-represented buyer, for example, and they come up to you and say, I would like to purchase a property, it doesn't mean that you just get to run roughshod over them. You have to provide forms to them as part of kind of your ethical obligation as a realtor. And the same is true for this situation. If someone doesn't have access to ORF forms, that doesn't mean that you have fair game on this contract until they purchase it. You should be, it's in your obligation as a realtor to complete this transaction to ensure that it moves smoothly, and that might mean providing those forms to the other party.
I'll just add, of course, we can't speak to ORF policies or ORF user agreements and all of that. All we can do is look at it from our side. We've provided a form, and we're trying to facilitate a way if, for some reason, people feel like it needs to be on wants to move it to one form or only uses one form, we've provided a way to facilitate that. And so from our end, we see it like it would be the unrepresented party where you are just sort of helping by providing those forms to facilitate the transaction on behalf of your client. But of course, we can't speak to what ORF policies are.
Oh, Erica?
We have a virtual hand raised.
Oh, perfect. Hi, Rosie.
Hi there. Question from the title and escrow professionals. Do you guys have a current plan for training or a good overview kind of directed at our folks so we can get familiar with these new forms?
Yeah, so and I'm actually going to be presenting at the Oregon Escrow Council conference this weekend. But yeah, we would love like I said, we're gonna send the link out next week to preview the documents, and we're gonna send that, in addition to our members, we'll send it to, to the title companies as well. And then in addition to the video trainings that Nicholas mentioned, we would love to do in-person or virtual briefings in whatever fashion works best for you, individual companies, collectively, whatever it takes for you to get comfortable and familiar. We're here to provide it, and our plan is to do that as part of this soft launch over the next few months before January 1st.
That's great. Thank you.
And we have had escrow counsel as part of the committee drafting these documents as well. So escrow concerns have absolutely been incorporated into the documentation that you'll be presented to.
In summary, you'll be hearing a lot from us in the coming months. So obviously we've had a lot of really great input and feedback today. So moving forward, what can Oregon Realtors do to provide us feedback to continually improve these forms in the coming years?
So first thing, as mentioned, we'll send the link out next week with the forms. Would love your initial feedback. A lot of eyes have been on this. We've had a task force, we've had attorneys, we've had outside experts, but of course, we're going to have 18,000 people now looking at it, and so we want any final feedback that you have before we sort of lock in the documents, get them uploaded into those platforms. So that's the first step. And as I mentioned, you also can come to these open houses and schedule brokerage briefings. Going forward, there'll be many ways to provide input. So in addition to these ongoing open houses that we'll have, probably not continually every week, once we, but maybe once a month after we get settled, we'll have, of course, via our website, easy ways for you to communicate your feedback. Because we're making Legal Hotline now available to everyone, we imagine a huge portion of any updates that would need to happen to the form will be information gathered via Legal Hotline. And scenarios that we learn about where people are running into sticky situations in their transaction will give us the information we need to update. At these conventions, fall and spring, just like we have a principal broker forum, now we'll have a forms forum. So there'll be, a lengthy opportunity for discussion among peers and principal brokers about what's working, what's not working, and how we can improve upon those forms. And then every other avenue that you have to connect with us as your state association, we're going to open up that avenue for you to provide input to us on forms. So, really one of the advantages of being able to provide forms as a state association is just all the connection points that we have through you. I mean, ultimately, we haven't done it yet. We'll likely need to, update our policies and bylaws with also, a more formal process or committee that we have. But we intend to seek feedback in all of the ways that we can, in person, online, Legal Hotline, here at convention, open houses, everything we can do.
Patrick?
Thank you. So I apologize. I haven't had a chance to look at the form yet, so I'm speaking a little bit from ignorance. But did you guys get rid of that junk that ORF put in the top of their form on the purchase and sale agreement, license, email, all that kind of junk? Because that's kind of created a standard of practice out here, where not only do you have to put your name and company and who you're representing, but they want their license number, the email, the phone numbers, and all that stuff that really isn't relevant to the transaction. And it's really has created a standard of practice, because I've got principal brokers having their agents ask for that information, because I typically don't put it in there because it's not required. So in fact, one of my agents just got a request from a lender for an addendum signed by all parties that has that information on there, which is not relevant to the transaction at all. So now my agent had to had to get a signature on a form that the other agent had drafted that has the license number of the agents on it. And, so that there's a perception out there that that's now kind of a required thing, when, unless it's changed, Oregon statute doesn't require that our license numbers be on the purchase and sale agreement. So I'm hoping you guys didn't include that stuff.
Well, the final agency acknowledgement language is laid out in regulation, and our final agency acknowledgement, is based off of the requirements of the regulation. We provide a lot more space for like teams, for multiple agents to be listed, and ours is a separate one-page document that goes along with the transaction. But we do make sure that it complies with the regulation. I actually think the license number is in the regulation requirement. So we made sure ours was compliant with the regulation. Now, I will say, one of the things that we've heard, and this has come up in the Business Issues Key Committee and related to the teams issue, is that there is often a challenge, particularly when dealing with teams, of sort of knowing, who's in charge and how to get a hold of them. And so we do want, and we've been working with the commissioner to try to address that issue through various means. And we do want our forms, to the degree they can, to be able to, be transparent, so people sort of know, who the brokers and principal brokers are involved and how to get a hold of them. So we don't have all of that covered in our final agency acknowledgement, but I do want to acknowledge that this has been an issue that's come up where people are asking to have information so that they can appropriately deal with issues when they arise. Okay.
Yeah, the final agency acknowledgement is a statutory requirement. It has to be there. So, yeah. So the final agency acknowledgement in the Library for Oregon Realtors is a one-page document that now has more room for you to put all parties that are representing, and it doesn't commingle with the first page of the sale agreement. It's first page of the package is the final agency acknowledgement, boom. Next page, sale agreement with all of the major terms between the buyer and seller on that page.
Rod, we have a question before you, and then I'll jump over to you.
Before you guys go, let me clarify this a little bit. Patrick, you're right, it's not statute. The license number or the addresses, that came as a result of Dodd-Frank. The lenders wanted it, and they wanted it included on the contract. You don't have to fill in those blanks, regardless of what your peers, who are more process than objective-oriented, might ask for.
Rod?
Thank you so much. This is Rod Barker, East Metro Association of Realtors. Has there been any look at accessibility, specifically to screen readers being able to edit the document? Thank you so much.
Yeah, I know we're working on it, and Erica, I don't know if you have anything to say there, but yeah.
So part of what we're doing with the documents are making sure that they are PDFs that will have blanks. We are also requiring, as we work with vendors, we're asking them about their accessibility. And lastly, we are working on doing some screen reader testing with them as we get from this draft where they're in right now to the draft in which they will be published. We'll be doing some screen reader testing on them as well to make sure that they are filled. And Rod, I will probably reach out to you to ask some follow-up questions.
I would love to help. The other set of documents, which we've all used a lot, are a train wreck when it comes to screen readers. I hate to say that, but it would jump from the top to the bottom to the top again, because in the behind the scenes of a PDF can be numbered. Some of you would know the coding to that, and if it's not coded correctly, it's just kind of a train wreck. But anyway, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for that feedback. And accessibility of the documents is very important to us, and we, commit to doing our best and continuously improving and learning and figuring out what it takes to make the documents accessible.
Erica?
Yes, I have two questions from online. I have one from Gail Rogers at CORE. If we supply forms to the other broker and they are not trained on those forms, what happens then?
Well, I mean,
Good question.
yeah,
Hopefully they read.
it's a good question. I mean, again, if I were you, I would get trained on both OREF and Oregon Realtors forms. That's what I would do.
And all the trainings will be on the library or online for free.
Before we answer that one, so that is the concern that does pop up in the legal hotline with the cab forms. We have had a handful of calls from time to time where someone calls up and says, I got a commercial offer on cab forms. I don't use them. I don't know what they say or how they work. Should I continue? Do I have to buy the cab form? What should I do? And the answer in the end is essentially you should figure out how cab forms work if you're going to be using them. If you're not willing to become trained on cab forms, you should request it's put on the form you understand. And if you can't do either of those, if the request doesn't change, or if you can't get trained on the cab forms, it's the risk management. The safest option you have is to simply say, it may not be the best option for this client. You may have to find someone else who is a specialist on this form because I'm not comfortable doing something I'm not knowledgeable about. So that it's not a great answer to give, but it essentially says if you don't know, you probably shouldn't be doing something in that regard because you are taking risk on yourself. And if you want to be maximally risk protected, get trained on those things or hand it to someone who is.
I'd just like to say, we're all professionals. I said that earlier. You get the training. It's going to be available to you. Know both sets of forms.
All right, Louis Hoffman would like to ask, from CORE again, would like to ask, could or would it be wise for each individual association to have a specific forms usage policy, not just an individual brokerage, since the majority of PSAs would be local?
I'll just answer that as the president of a large brokerage. And we have agents who are going to prefer one form over the other. Obviously, I've worked really hard with our task force on the forms that you're going to be given through your state association as a member benefit. And so I like them. And I hope that the agents in my company will use them. But I know that I have agents in my company who will use the OREF form. So as the president of my company, my attitude is I want to make sure that my agents have access to training on both forms and that they know how to use both forms and that whichever form is presented to them, they feel competent to use. And I think that's the best approach not only for brokerages, but you individually and for any other entity out there personally. But I'll let you guys speak to it legally.
No, I think that's fine. And I think the question may have talked about local associations. And again, come back to that. I mean, I think when you have multiple market participants, collaborating about, limiting use to one product, I think that creates significant antitrust concerns. So I wouldn't recommend that a local association do that. Yeah.
Greg?
Thank you. Greg Whistler from the East Metro Association. I was just thinking a little bit more about Gail's question about not being trained on a set of forms and stuff like that. I think we've all had opportunities to come in contact with maybe bank-owned property where the bank has its own set of forms, or new construction where the builder's got its own set of forms, and I'm not experts in those forms. At the point where I'm working with a form that I'm not familiar with, I'm going to encourage them to seek legal counsel if they don't have an understanding of the form. So that's where it comes to recommending an expert. Hey, here's an attorney you can talk to. Maybe they're going to help you clear up that form. But I'm certainly also going to get as much training as I can on forms that I'm using regularly. So.
Thank you. John?
Thanks again, John Hoops from Eugene. And I forgot to tell you my mantra with my first question, RDR, realtors don't read. Can't fix that. Question though, I sold many years ago in Wisconsin, and there was a piece in the sale agreement that said, in the event of destruction to the property prior to closing, if the damage is less than 15% of the value of the property, the transaction will go forward and the parties will cooperate to repair. If it's over that, the buyer can withdraw and walk. And in Lane County a few years ago, windstorm tree fell on a house. There's a little house over on the highway here that just burned to the ground, and it burned the side off the next house, which must have had asbestos siding because there's asbestos warnings all over that home. Did you guys happen to put any limit recommendations in the sale agreement?
Yes, we did.
Can you describe?
I'll let Nicholas speak to it, because actually I think he was the one that brought that to the table. But yeah, there are provisions for that. Go ahead, Nicholas.
It's probably easier to have this one where if you come up to the forms room after this, we can show you the provision in the contract. We have a risk of loss provision that covers those instances, that essentially explains how the parties are supposed to proceed when there's damage to the property. It creates essentially a optional obligation that the buyer can pull out of a contract if the property is destroyed. Alternately, the parties can renegotiate and extend closing dates out to a point where it's fixed, and it's a full provision. I'll show it to you.
And just real quickly, I looked it up, and I just want to apologize to Patrick, because Patrick, you were correct that the regulation does not include the license number for the final agency acknowledgement.
Lindsay Culver, PMAR. Question for the legal hotline: will you be giving advice for both forms?
Yeah, I mean, our intent. We've always given advice on the forms that exist now. We would intend to continue, to do that. Assuming, obviously, someone told us not to. That would be different. But our intent would be to continue to help our members, regardless of which form they use, navigate things that come up on their transactions, and we're completely indifferent to which form they use on the legal hotline, because our goal is managing their risk because they're our members, not because which form they're choosing to use.
Gotcha. And then also, you said it will be free from this point? It won't be the $149 a year, or?
Legal hotline will be provided as member benefit. Yeah.
Okay.
But with regards to that as well, one of the policies of the legal hotline is not going to be to say, if someone asks which form should I use, the response is that's your risk level, and it's something that you should discuss with your client or with an attorney. You should come up with your own answer on that. It's not the place of the legal hotline to tell you which form is best for you.
Mike.
Mike Warren, COAR. Just two comments, actually, as we were talking, I went through the website deal, so I think that's super important. It has a lot of information on there, the one you just mentioned, the OR forms. So I think as soon as we can get that out to everybody, and possibly everybody here that's hearing this, share that with people. The only other thing I wanted to comment is the section on for the licensees to have their license number. To me, that's super important, because as I get offers from out of the area, that's the first thing I check to see if they're licensed realtor, if they're not within my system. So I'm thankful that that's in there, because I think that's important. So.
And I think our final agency acknowledgement does have the license number on it and the information. And here's the thing. I mean, we want everybody's feedback, but there's no possible way we're going to be able to make everybody happy, right? I mean, we all know that. Somebody's not going to want the license number on there. Somebody is. We're going to give you the best form and document based upon the work of the task force and the committee and the people involved, and we're certainly going to hear your feedback. One of the other hopes that I have in this process is the sale agreement is substantially a good and relevant document. Unless there's a change in standard of practice, unless there's a change in statute, we probably shouldn't need to change that document too much, right?
So with that, the last question I have for you is, how can members in the coming weeks continue to learn more about our forms, and what would be the best resource for them to do that?
orforms.org. I don't think you need the www technically anymore.
Yeah,
but if you want to put that in there, go for it.
And sign up on the website or up in the room. Sign up for a brokerage briefing. Sign up for one of the forums open houses. Look for an email next week that includes a link to the website with the forums. Let us know if you have any feedback, and we're here for you to help in any way. And we'll also, of course, alert you when those videos are available, the training videos. And we have an email address that's on the website, phone number dedicated to forums. So reach out individually as well if you have anything you want to chat about.
Awesome. So if there's no further questions, I think that we will wrap it up. We do have a deep dive later this afternoon, so be sure that you're in attendance for that. Your CE credits for this event will be available via your member profile on Oregon Realtors website in 2 weeks. The recording of the session will also be available for CE and Oregon Realtors online portal by October 28th. And we would like to thank our sponsor for this conversation this morning, Online Ed, so thank you for being here. Next up is Ask an Appraiser, and it's better to be rude than sued at 10:45 in the rooms next door. Thank you.